perfect video for International Women's Day. I just think back to all the different kinds of explorers we could be. I just love that video. And what an iconic brand that has been through a lot since 1888. As I think back, I think about world wars and social upheavals and technological advancements, actually more than one pandemic even. Television hadn't even been invented at the time. But here we are, 130 years later, more, with Dr. Jill Tiefenthaler, who became the president of the National Geographic Society a little more than a year ago. She's the first female CEO, 5 months into the pandemic, and a real turning point for the organization. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today. Please welcome Dr. Jill Tiefenthaler.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's great to be with you.
Wonderful to have you here today. Jill, you're not only the first female CEO, you're really leading a female leadership team with a woman at the helm of the board of trustees, the editor-in-chief, the DE&I officer. That's a big sea change at Nat Geo.
It is. It's time, but it is a big sea change, and it's an honor to join you today and an honor to lead the society, which, as you mentioned, is such a storied and impactful legacy. As a former educator, a lot of my life, and a college president and a leader, I know that representation is really critical. So when I have my doctorate in economics, and way back when I did that work, I was one of only 2 women in my graduate school class. And that trend continued in many of my roles as an economist and an academic leader. So I really believe it's incredibly important to find opportunities to pave the way for women and BIPOC leaders and others that are historically underrepresented. And at Nat Geo, as a global nonprofit, this is now one of our key commitments to really focus on DE&I at every level of our work. It's part of our core values and integral to our new strategic plan, NG Next. And I think my appointment by the board really signals where we're headed, to a much more inclusive and accountable community. And we've made great strides. You mentioned we have a woman chairing the board with Jean Case. And just this year in January, we reached gender parity at the board level. And our senior team, Carolyn, is more than 60% women. And we now fund about half of our grants. We've reached gender parity in our new explorers, with nearly half of our grants going to women as well. And 65% of our grants are now going to explorers around the world who are doing work in their own countries rather than just sending Americans out to do work across the world. So lots of exciting things happening.
That is remarkable. You know, you mentioned that you came from an academic setting. You had been the president of a small but mighty liberal arts college in Colorado for almost a decade. Mm-hmm. How did you make the leap from that setting to a multi-billion-dollar, media consumer enterprise? What was your first thought when they called you?
Yeah, well, it was crazy because I spent my entire career in higher education, and I intended to spend the rest of it in academia. And you can imagine getting in a call and someone saying that you've been nominated for the job of CEO of National Geographic. And I had mentioned I'm an economist, and my first thought was, I am not a scientist. They do call economics the dismal science, but it's not quite the right thing. But I kept thinking, it's National Geographic. I have to explore this. I have to step outside my comfort zone. And of course, diving into it, I really saw it was an organization that shared so many of my values. I think often when people think of National Geographic, they think of the media side, the magazine and the channel, but the society, as you mentioned earlier, is a global nonprofit and has been since it started in 1888. And much like we support faculty in higher ed, at National Geographic, our main goal is supporting these amazing explorers around the globe. So to date, we've awarded more than 15,000 grants over the years, and some of those change makers will be familiar to you, like Jane Goodall or Jacques Cousteau, as well as those incredible people that you saw in the video, really highlight some of the kind of folks we're funding today. They're really a really incredible, diverse global community of science and conservationists and journalists and change makers and educators. And I'll just give you a couple examples. I could go on and on, but I know we only have a few minutes. Enrique Sala, who is our explorer in residence, and he's a marine ecologist. Enrique has this amazing story. 12 years ago, he left his career in academia one day because he realized that he was really writing the obituary of the ocean. And he really, rather than studying it, he wanted to protect it instead. So we launched with Enrique Pristine Seas, which leads expeditions with scientists and filmmakers, policy experts, and in collaboration with local communities, inspires the creation of marine protected areas, really focused on seafood security, curbing biodiversity loss, and mitigating climate change. And to date, the team has now established 26 marine protected areas around the globe. And their goal is to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030, sorry. We're really proud of that work. And one more amazing example for our celebration of International Women's Day, Paula Kahumba, who was our 2021 Rolex National Geographic Explorer of the Year. Paula is also our first explorer. We just added explorer to the board of trustees. So she's our first explorer trustee. And she's an ecologist and a dedicated conservationist. She has devoted her entire career to protecting elephants from environmental change and poachers. She's the CEO of Wildlife Direct in Kenya, and she helps conservationists report and publish findings. Her work has generated unprecedented support, including an amazing campaign called Hands Off Our Elephants. And that was done with Her Excellency Margaret Kenyatta, the First Lady of the Republic of Kenya. And Paula is not only a great scientist and conservationist, she's also an amazing storyteller. She created and hosts Africa's first wildlife documentary series, Wildlife Warriors, which engages people to see themselves as stakeholders in Africa's conservation efforts. And she's got a new education series for kids called National Geographic Kids that they're filming in Africa that's for and with African children. So those are two just amazing examples of the kind of people I get to rub shoulders with every day here at National Geographic.
Wow, that is just remarkable. And, I think I mentioned to you earlier, I think everyone in the audience remembers back so fondly to being kids and having that magazine show up. It was really how we connected with the world, and you're doing it in really new and exciting ways. Those new ways and new thinking don't just happen. Typically, it's a great leader with a great strategy. Tell us about your coming on board and developing the strategic plan that you mentioned. What kind of leadership skills did you draw on to get that done? One, so quickly, but two, during a pandemic when you were new. How did all that come together?
Well, the first thing I did when I arrived during the pandemic, as you can imagine, I was here in Washington. I moved to Washington, D.C. in the midst of the pandemic in August, and our building at the time was completely closed. And it continues to, we're still not back in the office today. But I dove right into listening. It's really one of my key values. I learned it throughout my work at the college. I spent a whole year of listening. And I'm a true believer in incredibly deep listening. So when I got here, I didn't take a whole year, but I did take about 4 months to do a listening tour at National Geographic. And Zoom actually provided an easy way to be able to do that because a lot of our explorers were home and people were happy to connect on Zoom with me. So I was able to reach out to our global community. So after my listening tour, I shared back a 40-page summary of what I heard, and the feedback affirmed our strengths and what work we needed to do to improve, and we were ready to move forward. And then we dove into the strategy work. Again, I led a very inclusive process. We had 5 months, 400 people, and about 6,000 virtual sticky notes. Our collective input really resulted in our mission, and we built our 5-year plan, NG Next. So I would just say listening, engagement, and process. Good, slow, and time intensive, but really ended up, I think, with a strong strategy. That's not just my strategy, right? It's the entire community strategy, and people own it and are a part of it. So now we're on to implementing.
Wow, talk about inclusive leadership. That is really, really inspiring. And funny that the pandemic conditions of Zoom actually enabled you to reach more people during that process. We'll call that a silver lining. Something that we talk about and work on every day here at the Chamber of Commerce and the foundation is workforce. What is the workforce of the future? Every CEO is trying to figure out what the workplace of the future will be, what kind of talent you need, how to be an employer of choice, especially getting women back into the workforce. How have you evolved the way that your team works, and maybe how you're thinking about the next chapter of your workplace?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I'm a labor economist by training, so this is something
Oh,
I'm fascinated by as well, because it is really we're seeing such a huge change. And I would say, first of all, it's, as I mentioned before, really important to listen to what folks need and to communicate. I mean, I've always been such a believer in the importance of communication, but it never became more important than during the pandemic. So we did all kinds of things at National Geographic to stay connected during this time. I sent a weekly note to my staff and trustees, and we held an all hands virtual meeting every 2 to 3 weeks. And during this time, I think people needed compassion and empathy more than they ever have. And it was a little hard as a new leader because I'd never met any of the staff in person, which made it really difficult. So we did a lot of things to try to create as much space and grace as we could. We created meeting free times. So we had the noon hour every day after 4 o'clock, always be meeting free times, especially for our families who are juggling care, whether that be kids or others that needed care during this time. We put our foot down and made people take vacation because we knew people were thinking maybe they wanted to save it for later, but we sensed that people were burned out. We provided some extra surprise days off occasionally throughout the time. And then we also provided stipends so people could set up comfortable at-home offices and be productive during that time. So really, flexibility has been key to our workers. And I'm really proud that our voluntary quit rate in 2021 was only 11%, which was about 23% in the DC region, and actually much higher than that for much of the country. So we are now about to bring people back to the office. So I hope that we can continue to hold on to our talented staff as we transition back. Starting the end of March, we'll be asking our hybrid staff to start coming into the office once a week. And then 3 weeks later, we will start our flexible work pilot, which is a 3-day in, 2-day out pilot plan that we'll run. And we have some core hours, and we're doing synchronous days in. I know a lot of organizations are letting people pick, but such an important part of our work here is cross-function collaboration. So we're hoping those 3 days in, 2 days out will make the most of people's time while they're here. The last thing we would do is bring people into the office and then have everybody on Zoom all day. So very much more careful meeting cadences and lots of opportunities for people for collaboration and engagement.
Wow. Again, really inclusive listening style of leadership. It's so admirable. I know we're almost out of time, so I'd like to close out with 2 questions, and you can choose which one, because I'd love to hear your views on either of them.
Sure.
One is, National Geographic Society is such a supporter of journalists and storytellers, and I wonder what you would like the next chapter and the next story of National Geographic to be. I'm also fascinated by your childhood growing up in Iowa, and did you imagine living in the Midwest and going to a small school, and I hope you'll tell us that story, that you'd become this kind of lead explorer today?
No, I'll pick up on that last one. I grew up on a farm in Iowa. It's kind of fun because it was a popcorn farm, and my family is still there, and they run that business in our small community of 500. But I was really lucky that my parents were very committed to education, and I was always curious about the world. Just like you, Carolyn, I remember that National Geographic magazine at the tiny little school in my hometown, and it transported me to places I never imagined. So I was able to, get off to that small liberal arts college and really fell in love with economics and academics, and never saw myself, doing anything other than that. But now, from the path from becoming a president at Colorado College and CEO of a global nonprofit, I look back and I can tell you that it's wonderful to still have all those connections in Iowa And I think my local community is pretty proud and excited about that journey as well.
Oh, that's exciting. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today for International Women's Day. This has been a really marvelous conversation, and I know I can't wait to see what else you do at the National Geographic Society and all of those great explorers and young people and young women in particular. So thank you again for joining us. Just really marvelous.
Yes, thank you for having me, Carolyn.
Thank you. Bye-bye.